Chapter 381 Nullified by Hydesgrain. Jason was still able to remain calm, knowing that there was no other strong beast around thanks to his mana eyes. However, that wasn't the case for the other young prodigies whose tension was already high from hunting the golden horned lion and Jason's sudden appearance. It was even worse after they had heard that the demonic three-eyed wolf could be nearby, as they had already witnessed its terrifying strength. As such, they panicked a little bit until the young man, who had stepped forward to talk to Jason before, announced, "Let's depart, right now. There is no time to waste." When Jason saw this, he couldn't help but suppress chuckling, thinking that they didn't even know where he saw the demonic three-eyed wolf. Only half a minute later he had still not received a question where exactly the beast was sighted before, which caused him to frown as he saw that the young prodigies ignored him, departing straight into the direction he came from. Clearing his throat, he said, "I would head the opposite way if I were you guys. At least if you don't feel like being killed by a destructive curse." After he said so, Jason exerted the weightless steps technique before he rushed towards a completely different direction, on his way to search for the possible survivors of the demonic three-eyed wolf's massacre. However, instead of looking for the debilitation centaurs, Jason wanted to find the one-eyed rats that seemed to have faced the same fate as the debilitation centaurs. It was unfortunate for those races and also Jason, as he had planned to find out more about their curses in order to pick the most suitable soulbond for him. Nevertheless, there was nothing he could change about the past. This thought allowed him to retain his calmness as he ignored the young men and women's gaze that followed him. More than a month had passed and one could see Jason fighting against a lowest lick stage Thunderstrike bull which he had encountered on his way towards the rift. During the last month, Jason had found himself in several dozen life-threatening situations one after another, all caused by the aftermaths of the exposed mana vein that seemed to turn every beast into a ferocious and mana-greedy being. After he sustained several dozen injuries, he couldn't help himself but allow Scorpio to liquefy his first drop of mana. Jason was sure that he could take Scorpio's amplification without much issues, as his mana absorption was slower and the fact that Scorpio had a potential limit at the lowest lick stage. He could only liquefy around 20 drops of mana, which was a rough estimation Jason did. However, this made it possible for Jason to allow Scorpio's advancement into the lick stage, which Artemis didn't want to accept. Yet, after Jason explained that it was only because Scorpio would reach his potential limit soon, which meant that Jason wouldn't have any problems giving Scorpio the opportunity to become stronger, Artemis accepted it. Her mana absorption and potential were unparalleled according to her own words, and Jason could just nod his head, accepting everything she tried to implement with the things she said. After he encountered the group of young prodigies, everything went downhill, and the only upside was that his mana core rank had reached the second master rank, while his mana core size should be comparable to that of a lowest lick stage. This was not important to Jason, who just wanted to increase his defensive capabilities by allowing Scorpio to break into the lick stage. By manifesting his exoskeleton, Jason's defense would become much stronger, while the stinger could be utilized to attack an unguarded opponent. Unfortunately, even after he had received the second baptism, Jason could tell that his vessel was still not strong enough. He was confident in taking on Scorpio's whole soul world amplification, which indicated that his vessel was strong enough for the time being. However, this was only for the time being. The worst opponent of his soul world amplification had yet to come. Artemis was something he couldn't take lightly, and her advancement was rapid as long as she received enough high-quality food. Even if that was not the case, allowing her to absorb as much mana from the surrounding area as she wanted was already enough, allowing her to reach a mana absorption rate that was higher than Scorpio's by a few times. Jason couldn't take this lightly, and he knew that allowing her to advance into the lick stage would slow his own progress drastically. That was because his mana core size would be enlarged every single time any of his soulbonds became stronger, increasing the demanded mana Jason had to accumulate to break to a new level. This was annoying, and if possible, he wouldn't have allowed Scorpio to advance to the lick stage. Unfortunately, The mythic garden had become more dangerous with each day passing, and he had yet to pick the cursed beast he wanted to take as soul bond. There were 3 cursed beasts that had a suitable soul amplification curse, which Jason was confident to catch and bind to himself. Both the one-eyed rat and debilitation centaurs survived, even if their population was decimated. This was however not tragic to Jason, who only needed one of those to bind to his soul. While the one-eyed rat's curse was stronger, its curse didn't vary and was straight at 20% decrease, while the debilitation centaur's curse was inconsistent between 3% minus 10%, which made Jason curious about it. The third suitable cursed beast he found was a small 3-tailed panther that seemed to be a variation evolution from the weakening cursed panther which he encountered on his first day, immediately after he arrived in the mythic garden. Almost 6 months had passed since then, and Jason had become more powerful, which allowed him to be able to catch the variation evolution of the weakening cursed panther. To Jason's bad fortune was the small 3-tailed panther's curse not up to the one-eyed rat's 20% weakening or the interesting inconsistent weakening curse of the debilitation centaurs. In the end, it was just the best looking and most powerful, thanks to it being at the lowest lick stage with a purple-colored hue enveloping it. This was the potential of a beast, Jason was able to see, and it indicated that the 3-tailed panther was able to reach the low lick stage, which was the best among all 3. Adding its darkness affinity and the fact that it is harboring a 10% soul world amplification curse, he would probably pick this beast as his next soul bond. There was also a 4th cursed beast that was considered the best out of the 3 he named prior. In the end, Jason would love to catch and bind the 4th one. Unfortunately, it was too strong and not something Jason could fight against, yet. Because of that, Jason couldn't help himself and thought that he should have the debilitation centaur as his next soulbond, use its curse for the time being to lighten the burden on his vessel to a certain extent before coming back to the mythic garden a year later. However, this was just a dream which Jason shattered before it infested his mind. It was unlikely for him to come back to the mythic garden in a year due to multiple factors. One of them was the fact that his strength might be out of the mythic garden's restrictions threshold, while another one was the fact that the woman that was at the sovereign rank and probably the matriarch from the Jewel clan. In that case, the 3-tailed panther would be the best choice, if he wanted to retain a high soul world amplification. Around 20% would be a large soul world amplification, but not something the most terrifying human prodigies didn't have. Otherwise, he would have to take the one-eyed rat whose curse would reduce his soul amplification to 13%. This would be comparable to that of above-average prodigies from big families, yet still in their normal range. While Jason pondered about what he should choose, he didn't even realize the alarming amount of mana that was suddenly unleashed several kilometers away from him. It was not only extremely dense and pure, but enveloped by complex emotions and the desire for blood. This bloodlust infested every living being, which caused them to go riot, attacking everything in their surrounding. Only minutes later did Jason hear the stamping of several hundred beasts and numerous voices echoing through the surrounding area. Distracted from his thoughts, he turned around, only to see several hundred humans riding on lowest lick stage beasts, that had varying mana drops ranging from 1 to several dozen within them, towards him. The strongest beast Jason was able to identify in this short moment had around 40 drops of mana within its mana core. In mankind's terms, 1 to 40 mana drops meant that a beast's strength ranged from the 1st magical rank up to the 4th magical rank. A beast would enter the 5th magical rank from the 50th drops of mana. As such, every 10 drops of mana, a beast would have an increase of 1 level in the magical rank. This was the same for the Magus rank, and it would only change from the Grand Magus and Guardian rank as the number of liquefied mana drops required to advance a level would increase by a large margin. They ignored Jason's entire existence and rushed past him, while only a few gave him an apologetic smile at most. There were 2 things Jason perceived after he had instinctively inserted mana into his eyes, enhancing their sight. Not only was he able to see the horrific mana fluctuations intertwined with bloodlust, but Jason could tell from which beast the bloodlust intertwined mana fluctuations radiated from. The color enveloping this beast was rare to see, and from the outlines he perceived, Jason couldn't help curse out. Only a moment later he had already manifested Artemis Wing before he used a large margin of mana to circulate through his wings. Turning around, he flew towards the huge group of young prodigies whose speed was much slower than his due to the second thing he perceived. Nobody has an enlarged mana core, which means that their soul world amplification is nullified, and even their soulbond's strength has been reduced by a quarter. How terrifying. Taking a deep breath, he utilized the mana he inserted into Artemis Wings perfectly. Additionally, he used the hull amplification of 100% from her due to the fact that she was currently inside his mana core to use his fastest speed. This was enough to rush past every human prodigy riding on their soulbond until he reached the front. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the young man, who was the master of the beast with 40 drops of mana. What are you doing? However, before he could even finish his sentence, Jason felt as if his whole body was overwhelmed by a sudden tiredness, as his soul amplification had been completely nullified. Chapter 382 Fate-Changing Fruit by Hydesgrain. Scorpio's amplification of 33% hit suddenly rock bottom with a big 0%, while Artemis' amplification that has been raised to 100% due to the fact that she resided in his mana core was halved. This shocked Jason greatly, and his speed was barely comparable to an average 8th master rank thanks to the fact that his mana core rank was at the 2nd master rank and enlarged by a small margin from both baptisms he had received from Solaris. What the hell is going on? Why is the petrification serpent in a berserk state, and how is its curse so strong? Jason lamented, not knowing how he should keep with the pace everyone else was rushing past him. Suddenly he felt a huge hand grasping his waist as he was lifted on top of a large, fiery saber-toothed tiger where two men were already seated. You are always good for a surprise, Jason. I didn't expect to see you here, with a fortified soul conjunction at that. Turning around, the young man who grasped him said, ISGA. Jason exclaimed, both shocked and happy to see his friend, while the person in front of Iska just lifted his hand saying, You're welcome. Artemis Wings dissipated in order to make himself more space as he made himself comfortable on the mount after taking a few deep breaths. He couldn't even say, thank you, yet, but the young man, that had to be the master of the fiery saber-toothed tiger, didn't bother about that. Nevertheless, Jason couldn't help but say thank you, knowing that he would die any moment if he were to be rejected from staying on the saber-toothed tiger. The petrification serpent's body shot out of the forest, revealing its bloodshot eyes that began to glow in a faint brown goldish light as the weakest lowest lick stage beasts had begun to slow down. They had been paralyzed, and Jason couldn't help but sigh, knowing that they would die any moment as he averted his gaze. Looking forward, his attention was drawn to the young man that was mounted on a beast called Hurricane Carnosauria. Carnosaurias belonged to one of the extinct races that reappeared after the mana outbreak. This dinosaur had been long since extinct and reappeared so suddenly. However, this was not important to Jason or anyone around because the Hurricane Carnosauria was the fastest soulbond. Other than that, it was also the strongest with the most liquefied mana drops inside its mana core. But this was also not important for Jason right now because he stared through the young man riding on the Hurricane Carnosauria as he cursed. Why did this idiot steal one of the petrification serpent's eggs? Iska and the young man in front of him stiffened when Jason said this. What did you say? WHO. Iska's voice turned ice cold, which was something Jason hadn't seen from his new friend before. The young man on the Hurricane Carnosauria, didn't you two know that? Why are you all even in this large group? This doesn't look like a picnic to me. While Iska was fuming in anger, the young man in the front explained the situation to Jason calmly. First of all, my name is Yoon Shiabi, and I'm from the Shiabi clan. You should know about it, right? Even if you don't, it doesn't matter. What you should know is that every few dozen years, the mythic garden gives birth to a fruit called Fate-Changing Carado. There are multiple things you can do with the fruit, but the most important effect of it is that you can reawaken your soul if you eat the fruit whole. However, this is not what we were supposed to do. In the end, Kanir's most prominent alchemist was able to mass-produce a potion called Soul Enhancing Potion after he had gotten his hands on this fruit the last time it emerged. There had been around 100 potions concocted, and every single one of them was worth a huge fortune, which some influential families have procured over centuries. Either way, the effect of such a potion is extremely potent and allows the person who drinks it to change his or her fate completely. From a 3-star soul awakening to a 4 or even 4.5-star soul awakening, everything was possible as long as you were talented enough. I think you can already imagine what we were supposed to do, and that was definitely not to steal the petrification serpent's precious egg, causing it to enter a berserk state. That bastard from the Warad family will get to know what it means to be besieged by several big clans once I get out of here, this fucking son of a bitch. In the beginning, Yoon's explanation was calm, but it turned more and more violent, which caused Jason to gulp down his saliva. I guess the Warad clan will have a large problem soon. Jason saw that this young man from the Warad family was trying his best to hide the small egg that was placed in the pouch that hung on his belt. However, his mana eyes perceived everything, which included the mysterious color enveloping the petrification serpent's egg. If the petrification serpent wouldn't be behind us, I would give everything to get my hands on that egg. He had started to daydream once again, only to be interrupted by his soul that began to revolt against the petrification serpent's curse. Shaking violently, the soul amplification curse began to change from a decrease of 50% to 40%, down to 10% before it shot up again. It was as if his world and the soul amplification curse were clashing, trying to find out who the strongest is. This allowed Jason to understand that not his origin as a Celestia halfling had been the main source for the debilitation centaur's curse to be inconsistent. Rather than that, it was his soul world core fighting against the foreign object which the curse targeting him was. However, in that case, Jason couldn't say for sure whether his soul was influenced by the Celestia DNA he received. The same was now occurring with the petrification serpent's race-specific weakening curse. As such, he tried to get the hang of himself as he mumbled to Iska and Yoon. Should we change our direction and drift away from the Hurricane Carnosauria? In that case, we wouldn't be targeted by the petrification serpent. Jason's idea was logical and the best way out of the tricky situation. Unfortunately, this would mean sacrificing everyone else, which was something Yoon didn't want to do. He rejected Jason's idea when Iska mumbled once he calmed down a little bit. If we're able to get rid of this son of a bitch from the Warad family, there shouldn't be a problem. The petrification serpent would get its offspring back and get revenge too. But that would be difficult too, because the Warad family would not only complain to the person who caused the descendant's death but probably declare war. In the end, you can only see the petrification serpent's egg, right? You have no other evidence we could use to justify getting rid of that bastard. Somehow, Jason was glad that Iska was able to analyze everything level-headed, but his words were somewhat vulgar, which was not like he got to know him in the Mythic Garden. Suddenly, he got an idea as he asked, "Is the fiery saber-toothed tiger able to run faster? Maybe even take over the Hurricane Carnosauria? Just for a few seconds." Yoon pondered for a moment before he shook his head. "We won't even come close to the Hurricane Carnosauria." Using his mana eyes, he tried to find something that could help them because the petrification serpent was approaching them at a rapid pace. Suddenly his gaze strafed past Yoon before it returned to the young man in front of him. Thinking about what he should say, Jason got an idea. "Yoon, didn't you say that you come from the Shabi clan? In that case, it wouldn't be surprising if you have a spatial affinity soulbond, right?" When Yoon heard this, he was astonished for a moment before he nodded his head, which caused Jason to question him further. "In that case, you should be able to open a spatial gate too, at least I think, or is that not the case? If you can, How far is the distance? Can you create a small gate a few meters in front of the Hurricane Carnosauria? Understanding what Jason wanted to implement, Yoon had to bring him back to reality as he said, I might be able to create a spatial gate in front of the Hurricane Carnosauria, but it wouldn't be large enough for the whole Carnosauria to fit through. This would shatter the portal, and make everything useless. However, Jason couldn't help but turn serious as he asked, who said that the Hurricane Carnosauria should fit through the spatial gate if I'm enough? Chapter 383 Desperation by Hydesgrain. Iska, who listened intently to Yoon and Jason's discussion, couldn't help but exclaim, what the hell do you want to do? Don't forget that we are all cursed by the soul amplification curse. You know that you can't rely on that. With your current strength, you shouldn't be able to steal the petrification serpent egg from someone at the lowest lick stage without any soul world amplifications. Jason felt good to see how worried Iska was, when he said, I should be able to negate the soul amplification curse for a short moment. With the fortified soul conjunction I have and the strength I receive through it, my combat prowess should be on par with the young man from the Warad family. Taking him by surprise, everything should be good, I guess. Both Iska and Yoon couldn't help but turn around to Jason to look at him, thinking that he was too full of himself. It may be something special that he was able to suppress the soul amplification curse, but this caused him to wonder why he wanted to risk his life for strangers. After Jason would get his hands on the petrification serpent egg, what would he do? Approach the petrification serpent and tell her that he got his hands on the egg in order to bring it back. Most beasts with liquefied mana were intelligent, but to what degree would a low lick stage beast be able to stay calm and think rationally, even more so if it was about their offspring? The petrification serpent was in a berserk state which told everyone that it was implausible to expect rational thinking. Jason was definitely not a saint, and he wouldn't do something suicidal like that under normal circumstances. It was also not something he wanted to do either, but Jason perceived something which changed his stance. Saving the prodigies that wanted to obtain the fate-changing Carado fruit might even be a disadvantage to him, because Jason could tell from which family some of them belonged. From rumors and secured information he had received through his masters, he could roughly estimate which family was good and what family was bad. However, in the end, almost all big families, clans, and even companies had something to do with the foreign races and human trafficking. Most of them decided to only use criminals to trade with, but Jason was still not sure what to think about this. As such, rather than doing something suicidal to save others he didn't even know, Jason followed his instincts. Those instincts, in addition to what his mana eyes perceived, told him that he had to get his hands on the petrification serpent egg that was in the hands of the young man from the Warad family. While his instincts were screaming out the desire to secure the egg, his mana eyes were able to perceive a thick aura enveloping the petrification serpent egg. This was not the strange, unknown, and mysterious color Jason could also perceive, but rather the unhatched petrification serpent's desperation and hopelessness it released. Astonished about this, Jason couldn't help but look at it more intently. It was similar to the earth dragons and foreign races who were able to release emotion-intertwined mana, only that the beast in front of him was still unhatched. Yet, it was already desperate enough to exhaust itself by doing something it shouldn't be able to do. Jason could only assume that the unhatched petrification serpent was aware of its fate if the bipedal beast that abducted it were to be able to escape from its mother's pursuit. However, this was not enough to convince Jason to do something as suicidal as ambushing two lowest lick stage beings that were much stronger than him, just to retrieve the petrification serpent egg. The young man might be on par with Jason's strength if he were to take him by surprise, but the Hurricane Carnosauria was something Jason couldn't take lightly. Even after it was targeted by the weakening curse, its strength was still manifold higher than Jason's. The final factors that caused Jason to change his attitude was a combination of everyone's desperation, which was the smallest reason for him to act like that. More important was the desperate aura around the petrification serpent suddenly targeted Jason, who was more than several dozen meters away from it. While the petrification serpent mother was still around 300 meters away from the lowest lick stage beast it was pursuing, the fiery saber-toothed tiger Jason sat on was in the center of the whole group, around 50 to 100 away from the hurricane Carnosauria. When Jason sensed that the unhatched petrification serpent seemed to undergo a substantial change which caused its aura to be released in a radius of around 10 meters, he was already astonished. However, seeing that it began to concentrate its aura on a single target which he seemed to be, Jason couldn't help but feel shocked. After he was enveloped by the unknown aura the unhatched beast had released, Jason felt weird and uncomfortable, but at the same time energetic, thinking that he should help out. In the end, he felt that the unhatched petrification serpent wanted to tell him something, and he was just unable to understand what was going on. Nevertheless, Jason was able to tell that nothing would happen to him if he were to retrieve the petrification serpent. There was nothing reassuring in this thought and just his own instincts that told him to help after he had been enveloped by the weird, desperate aura. Did the unhatched petrification serpent target me with its weird aura because of the same reason as the earth dragons? They said that he was enveloped by something, which they had also called aura. This aura seemed to turn him into a more trustworthy person, and Jason couldn't help but think that this might be the reason for the unhatched petrification serpent to rely on him. Or did it choose me because of something else? Jason didn't know why the unhatched petrification serpent had chosen him as its target, but he could tell that it was better if he were to do something instead of sitting around. He and everyone else would die if that were to be the case, and Jason loved to live, which was unsurprising. Fuck it. Let's do it. Yoon, can you create a spatial gate behind me and the other, connected gate around 5 meters in front of the hurricane Carnosauria, maybe 1 meter to its left, that is if you can do that accurately while we're running on that pace. Iska, I'll change my position in a moment. Can you use your whole force to push me through the gate with all your might? After I manifested my soulbond's wings I should be able to take a stance, allowing you to push my feet. Both Iska and Yoon were pondering for a moment when Iska suddenly asked, "Are we seriously considering this?" However, Yoon couldn't help but say, "It's not the worst plan, to be honest, as long as the petrification serpent mother retrieves its egg, nothing should happen. The only problem would be how to deliver the egg without breaking it. It might be more endurable than other eggs due to the durable eggshell it should have, but throwing it through the air wouldn't be the best decision either." After he said so, Yoon smiled lightly at Jason, with gratitude glimmering in his eyes. Yoon seemed to have accepted the plan without further ado, which caused Jason to look at him weirdly. Is he even weirder than I am? Does he think I do that to help everyone? Let me take care of the delivery too, just don't bother about me and leave once I retrieve the petrification serpent egg. There is no need to involve more people than necessary. When Jason said that, he felt slightly guilty to deceive Yoon with the last words he said, as they were utter garbage. After a few seconds passed, Yoon and Iska nodded their head, accepting Jason's tactic, if one were to call it like that. The petrification serpent mother was now only 200 meters away from the slower lowest lick stage beasts. Time was ticking and the three prepared themselves quickly. Jason manifested one of the Viridi Starstream daggers in his hand while leaving the other hand empty while Yoon took a few deep breaths. Iska rolled up his sleeves as he tested a few motions on how to throw Jason to receive the most efficient outcome. After that, Artemis wings manifested on Jason's back, which he laid close on his back as he asked, "Is everyone ready?" Chapter 384 Wing Thief by Hydesgrain. Iska was still unable to understand why Jason would do something as suicidal as retrieving the petrification serpent's egg and delivering it back to its mother too. The former was still something he could understand if he were to think about it carefully, over a long period, but the latter was definitely ununderstandable. However, if Jason wanted to do it, he could at least give his utmost effort to provide Jason with the best support. That was at least what Iska thought. As such, he tried out multiple movements to figure out how to push Jason, and when he saw how Jason positioned himself, he couldn't help but think that his new, yet suicidal friend knew what he was doing. Taking the stance Jason took in addition to the strength he could utilize to push him into account, Aisha was able to predict how fast Jason would be. Yoon gave them the sign that he was ready, which intensified the tension around them within a moment. Iska's finger itched while Jason took a deep breath to calm down. Counting down from 3, Yoon manifested the spatial gates at the exact position Jason wanted them to be once the countdown had finally reached 0. At the same time, Iska used the majority of mana that was left inside his mana core to circulate it through his arms. This enhanced his strength and Iska pushed Jason with all his might. Meanwhile, Jason used a large amount of mana to insert them into Artemis' wings that were still tightly folded on his back. Meanwhile, Jason's Soul World Core used all its might to suppress the Petrification Serpent's soul amplification curse for 1 second. This allowed Jason's strength to soar by several levels at once. In less than a quarter of a second, he was already pushed through the spatial gate as he emerged on the other side of it, facing the more than 6-meter-tall Hurricane Carnosauria that was baffled about the suddenly manifested spatial gate, only for a winged human to shot through it. Not even a full second passed when Jason shot past the Hurricane Carnosauria that couldn't react in time. The young man from the Warad family was even more baffled than his soulbond as he exclaimed in shock, only to see a mana weapon glimmering in the masked, winged human's hand. He wanted to unsheath his longsword to defend against the oncoming attacks as Jason emerged on the young man's side. At that moment, Jason sliced the Viridi Starstream dagger across the young man's waist, cutting off the pouch on his belt. Additionally, he inflicted a small cut that was however not something that mattered to Jason. He had wanted to retrieve the unhatched Petrification Serpent, nothing more or less. Opening Artemis' wings after he had grasped the cut pouch that was about to fall from the ground, he soared into the air before anyone was able to react. All of that happened in 1 second, and once that second had passed, Jason felt how the soul amplification curse backlashed. The Soul World Core was unable to hold back the curse that was seen as a foe, decreasing his combat prowess once again. After he got his hands on the unhatched Petrification Serpent, Jason was unsure what he should do next. He was currently more than 30 meters in the air, looking after the large group of several hundred prodigies mounted on their soulbonds. Averting his attention to the Petrification Serpent whose bloodlust intertwined mana was targeting Jason, the beings with its offspring in his hands. Shivering, Jason had the sole desire to run away as far as possible when the unhatched Petrification Serpent that was still in its egg began to release a soothing aura that was targeted its mother and Jason. While Jason's fear began to dissipate, he could feel that the horrifyingly high pressure of the bloodlust intertwined mana reduced drastically. Unbeknownst to himself, Jason caressed the Petrification Serpent egg as it was already an instinct for Jason to caress everything that released any kind of aura towards him. This was something Artemis and Scorpio became proficient in as they demanded to be caressed almost all the time. When the unhatched Petrification Serpent that was connected to its shell felt this, its soothing aura changed to joy, which was the complete opposite to the desperation it had released only moments ago. The moment the Petrification Serpent mother noticed this, it retraced its bloodlust intertwined mana was retraced, confusion spreading through its entire being. Jason was also confused because he felt such intense emotions within him originating from his soul bonds that were currently cursing the unhatched Petrification Serpent as it was caressed, and they weren't. Even Solaris, the black origin flame, felt like Artemis and Scorpio. It may be unable to be caressed like Jason's other soul bonds, but after it sensed how much attention Artemis and Scorpio had received, it wanted to have the same amount of attention than they had. All of that only began to happen after Solaris evolved into a Tier 1 flame, which allowed it to become a true sentient being. Jason, whose tension was on a completely different level, couldn't help but frown. Suddenly he sensed several wind blades flying towards him at a rapid pace. Distracted by his soul bonds nagging and the unhatched Petrification Serpent's joyous aura that was directed towards him, Jason was unable to notice them early enough. Thus he was unable to evade them properly. The most he could do was to instinctively release a thick wall of black flame, as they were the affinity he was the most proficient with. Using every trace of mana left within him, the black flame wall was extremely thick and compressed, burning the mana that held the wind blades together. However, 2 out of the batch of several wind blades made a big curve around the wall of flames. Their trajectory had been changed mid-air, but they were still controlled to a certain degree, allowing them to shoot towards Jason. Piercing through his wings, they were almost severed, and Jason had to dissolve them to prevent any major injuries that Artemis could obtain. Even if he was sorry for Artemis, who screamed out in pain, he couldn't help but care about his own situation right now as he fell to the ground from an altitude that was more than 30 meters. Suddenly he saw multiple more wind blades shooting towards him, and his eyes widened involuntarily. While he tried to evade the wind blades earlier, the pitch-black mask loosened up, revealing his face to the petrification serpent mother that couldn't help but eye Jason weirdly for a quarter of a second. However, Jason couldn't care less about anything except the wind blades that shoot towards him as he switched out Artemis, who was still in his mana core, with Scorpio. Only a moment later, his whole body was enveloped in a thick sapphire blue exoskeleton that looked like he was wearing a full body armor. Even his head was included, as a thick and long stinger grew out of his coccyx. Scorpio's mana core was barely at the lowest lick stage, but his defense capabilities were nothing to scoff at. Nevertheless, the several wind blades that shot towards him pierced into Scorpio's exoskeleton, and it was as if they targeted exactly the same area. The young prodigy from the Warad family seemed to have high proficiency with the wind affinity that was almost at the low lick stage, which allowed him to control the wind blades accurately. When Jason noticed this, he cursed out loud before he curled up his body, protecting the petrification serpent instinctively. At the same time, he accessed the mana sphere bracelet, which he was still wearing, to draw out as much mana as he could handle right now. Enveloping himself with the mana chain and dahlia stored within, a thick cocoon formed, protecting him from the high-velocity wind blades that shoot towards him. Just a moment later, he crashed into the ground, forming a small pit. Now that he was enveloped in a mana cocoon, Jason knew that he was fine for the next few seconds, which caused him to take a short glance to see how injured Artemis was. In the beginning, he thought that her wings might have been severed, but that was fortunately not the case. Adding the fact that the body parts manifested through the fortified soul conjunction weren't exactly the same as the original, Jason could only sigh in relief. A small part of the injury the replica sustained would be transmitted to the original, which was something nobody knew the reason about, but that was everything that would happen. As such, Artemis seemed to be fine, even if her wings were hurting, while Scorpio's exoskeleton had a deep cut in the back. Jason knew that one of the wind blades pierced into his back too. Its might was fortunately drastically decreased by Scorpio's exoskeleton, the mana grade 2 leather armor he was wearing, and the fact that Jason explosively released the mana sphere's mana. Everything was fine. Now that Jason laid on the ground, without a single trace of mana left, while most of his energy was used up to manifest Artemis and Scorpio's body parts, he could only take a look at the petrification serpent egg, which he embraced tightly. It released a worried and fearful aura as Jason's attention was diverted to the direction in which the petrification serpent was previously at. However, instead of being 200 meters apart from him, the petrification serpent mother had already appeared right in front of him as it opened its huge mouth as if it wanted to devour the cocoon enveloping Jason and the petrification serpent egg. Chapter 385 Gathering of the Strongest. By Hydesgrain. Jason was astonished to see that the petrification serpent wanted to devour them, but somehow he wasn't scared. There was no killing intent radiating from it, and rather than that, Jason felt a sense of gratitude emerging within him. This was weird because he shouldn't feel like that for anything, only to notice that this feeling stemmed from the petrification serpent mother that took the cocoon, enveloping him and the unhatched petrification serpent, into its maw. Supplying the cocoon with more mana to prevent anything unpredicted to happen, Jason noticed multiple emotions flooding him. Most of them were from the petrification serpent mother that thanked him, while the unhatched petrification serpent tried to figure out more about Jason, who was completely different from the bipedal beast that had abducted it. Jason was also different from what its mother told the unhatched petrification serpent about those bad bipedal beasts. He didn't have any bad intentions, and his aura was drawing the unhatched petrification serpent towards Jason, which caused it to release its aura towards its mother as if it was trying to communicate. Thanks to his mana eyes that perceived everything with mana around him, Jason could tell that their way to communicate with each other was unique, yet extremely efficient, as they didn't have to use any noises. Somehow, he was extremely calm and not a tiny bit worried that something might happen to him. Subconsciously he continued to caress the black egg while the petrification serpent turned around, halting its pursuit. Slithering back, the young prodigies, who continued to ride away from the petrification serpent as far as possible, sighed in relief. Meanwhile, Yoon glared at the bastard of the Warad family who had attacked and almost killed Jason. In the end, Jason, who was not only young and with a high mastery to absorb mana but had also fortified soul conjunctions with his soul bonds, ended up in the petrification serpent's stomach. He wanted to kill this bastard so badly, but he couldn't do that because there were witnesses. With the possibility of waging a war, Yoon was unable to do as he pleased, only to see that Iska was oddly calm. "Hey, Iska. Wasn't your friend killed right now? How the hell are you so calm? Shouldn't you be enraged or at least a little bit sad about your friend's fate?" However, Iska's answer baffled him as he calmly said, "You know what? I don't think he is dead. I saw the same thing you did, but why do I feel like he is still alive? Even weirder is that my instincts tell me that he will return stronger than he already is." Yoon couldn't even remotely comprehend what was going on with his friend, but instead of bothering Iska about this, he could only sigh deeply, hoping that his words were true and that Jason didn't die through someone like Faye Warad. Alright, let's hope that he survived. 2 hours passed and Jason thinned the mana around the cocoon in order to use his mana eyes to figure out where they were heading to. There were only 8 days left before the Mythic Garden Rift would close, and it would be bad if he were to be unable to leave it. It was not like it would be devastating and the cause for his inevitable death, but it would interrupt the plan he and his masters had made up. In the end, he had to do a few things on Argos which he couldn't do inside the Mythic Garden, and waiting for another 6 months wouldn't be helpful either. On the other hand, it might be great for him to increase his strength to a great extent if he were to stay inside the Mythic Garden too. Nevertheless, his plan, for now, was to survive, leave the area in which the petrification serpent was currently inside, and search for a suitable cursed beast to form a soul bond contract with. He had already formed a great bond with the petrification serpent egg which he was currently caressing in his hand, but Jason doubted that its mother would allow it to leave with him. Furthermore, Jason couldn't even say for sure that the unhatched petrification serpent felt the same about that bond as he did. This thought was quickly interrupted by the things his mana eyes perceived from the surroundings which the petrification serpent mother had entered. Goosebumps covered his body, and the only thing that allowed him to remain calm was the fact that he had manifested Scorpio's exoskeleton, in addition to the fact that he was currently inside the petrification serpent's mouth. I have to stay calm now. I'm inside one of the strongest beasts within the Mythic Garden, and even multiple low-lig stage beasts shouldn't be enough to kill it, I guess. But why are there more than a dozen cursed and blessed low-lig stage beasts in front of us? Jason was unsure what was going on, but he could feel the petrification serpent mother's shock, telling him that this encounter was definitely not something it planned out before. Am I haunted by bad luck? Jason began to wonder as the petrification serpent mother dug a small pit with its head before it laid down the cocoon, without anyone noticing it. Unsure about what would happen now, he couldn't help but feel that something extremely bad was about to happen. He terminated the supply of mana from his mana sphere and the cocoon enveloping him, and the petrification serpent egg began to dissipate. Jason was immediately vigilant against everything because his mana eyes perceived the outline and familiar mana fluctuations of the demonic three-eyed wolf. As such, he had to be careful of beasts and possible curses. Looking around, he noticed that the area he was inside was not only filled with thick mana currents but that it also looked like the intersection of several environments. On his left, Jason saw a mountain, while the gigantic forest he was already familiar with was right next to it. However, there was also a swamp next to the mountain, and right next to the swamp were flatlands. Other than that, there was also a forest with smaller trees, a flower plain with small hills, a jungle, and a forest whose outer appearance indicated that the whole area was dead. Why did the petrification serpent bring us to the center of the mythic garden? At least I guess it's the center. More important than that is, however, the question of why exactly the petrification serpent is so astonished to see the other overlords here. Is that something odd? Unsure whether he should wait for the petrification serpent that slithered away from him and its unhatched offspring, releasing a weird aura that seemed like it wanted to bid farewell, or that he should run away as far as possible, taking the petrification serpent egg with him. At least that was how Jason tried to interpret it. He was unsure whether his translation was correct or not. Meanwhile, the petrification serpent egg was releasing an enormous amount of emotions at once, which it wanted to target its mother, that was not there anymore. As such, Jason was targeted with the emotions as he was the being the unhatched petrification serpent egg was the closest to. This was at least what Jason thought when he suddenly remembered that there should be more petrification serpent eggs. Initially, he didn't understand why the petrification serpent mother approached Mythic Garden's center, but after he thought about the other eggs it had, Jason began to wonder if they were in a nest at the center. Is the center some sort of place to give birth and raise one's offsprings? He asked, not sure if his assumption made sense or not. However, it was a fact that the petrifaction serpent slithered towards several of the most terrifying ranked beasts of the Mythic Garden, who were waiting for something. They were unmoving and not fighting against each other, and Jason couldn't help but curse quietly as he tried to calm down the unhatched petrification serpent that began to shake in his hands. He remembered what the Earth Dragon transmitted about his aura and eyes as he inserted mana into them before his eyes were trained on the egg in front of him. Thinking about something nice and not the petrification serpent's death that seemed to be inevitable, and a desperate attempt to rescue the remaining eggs, his eyes began to glow faintly. This glow enveloped the unhatched petrification serpent's egg gently, calming it down, halting the forced hatching process it was about to initiate. Chapter 386 Inevitable Fate by Hydesgrain. After the petrification serpent egg stopped shaking, Jason continued to stare at it with his glowing golden eyes until the complex set of emotions within the unhatched petrification serpent's aura began to calm down. Jason was unsure if talking to it was helping, but he felt like doing so. Once he saw that everything seemed fine, Jason could finally avert his attention from the petrification serpent egg to the more important and dangerous Mythic Garden Center area. Since he was distracted before, Jason didn't notice what happened when the petrification serpent entered the center, but from the looks of it, there had yet to start a fight. This astonished Jason a little, but it allowed him to hope that the assumption he had was wrong. The distance from his location to the center was several hundred meters, enough to stay hidden as long as his mana core was concealed and the petrification serpent egg in his hands didn't act up. Looking towards the center, Jason perceived the outlines of the demonic three-eyed wolf, the boneflame centipede, and a humanoid being with horns and the lower part of a goat, also called satyr. This was most likely the Dark Satyr. There were also a few more beasts he couldn't perfectly decipher left, but from the information he had read within the handwritten Mythic Garden book, there were probably the Deathbed Flower, the Silver-Eyed Rabbit, the Millennium Cotton Shep, the Winged Fortune Tiger, and the Draconic Fate Hawk. Even one or two of those beasts Jason saw would be enough to be a threat to the petrification serpent mother that had already exhausted itself by releasing the bloodlust intertwined mana for a long period. Jason was also sure that the petrification serpent egg hadn't been laid for a long time, which might be an additional factor for the petrification serpent mother's exhaustion. However, even though the current situation looked perilous, Jason couldn't just leave with the petrification serpent egg. At least not until he saw that the petrification serpent would be attacked by the present low-lig stage beasts that harbored all kinds of curses and blessings. It was not like he didn't want to run away as far as possible, but then, Jason had to take the egg in his hands with him because he was unable to abandon it. He might have not known the unhatched petrification serpent for more than 3 hours, but this short period was already enough for him to decide that he wanted it to face reality. This might sound dumb even for Jason because the petrification serpent has yet to hatch, but its intelligence seemed to be on par with beasts that had liquefied their mana already. As such, Jason knew that running away would be worse for the unhatched petrification serpent, as it might never find out whether its mother survived or died. Being unaware of its mother's fate would be worse than knowing that it died, and Jason could only sigh deeply as he mumbled, "Once the situation turns too dangerous, I'll run away, just that you know." He was not even sure if the unhatched petrification serpent was able to understand him to some extent, as it shouldn't be the case, but unbeknownst to himself, Jason spoke in the universal language of all foreign races. This allowed the petrification serpent inside the egg to understand the rough meaning of Jason's words. What he didn't know was that not only every foreign race could speak the universal language, but that also all beasts were able to roughly understand words spoken in the universal language too. Seeing how calm the unhatched petrification egg turned, Jason couldn't help but feel that his words had some kind of effect. He told himself that the calmness he radiated had to be the reason for it to calm down before he focused his full attention on the center of the mythic garden where the tension seemed to intensify. When he saw this, Jason couldn't help but grit his thought as the climax of tension had been reached, which caused every present beast to unleash their entire mana and abilities. The surrounding landscape vibrated, and it felt as if every leaf, blade of grass, and tree began to move from the sheer mass of mana those beasts had released. The fight had yet to start, but Jason could already tell that it was over when he saw how terrifying the unleashed mana that was intertwined with all kinds of blessings and curses. There were only a few beasts in front of Jason that possessed an affinity, but that was not necessary because he would never underestimate a beast that was able to release such a huge amount of mana at once. In fact, he was able to tell that they had yet to go all out. Subconsciously, he took a few steps back when he saw that the blessed beings utilized their blessing to the fullest extent, while the cursed beasts targeted the petrification serpent as their sole target with the curses they harbored. Gritting his teeth, Jason could only say sorry when he took a few more steps back until he saw how the weakening curse on him dissipated into thin air as the petrification serpent unleashed everything it could to overload the curses it harbored. At least that was what he assumed to happen, because he was unable to explain what his mana eyes perceived. The petrification serpent's weakening curse decreased each of the surrounding beasts' combat prowess by roughly 30%, which shocked Jason a lot. However, overloading the curse was not something that came without backlash, and Jason perceived that the petrification serpent mother's mana fluctuation became unstable. Did it already exhaust its whole mana? He began to wonder as the black-scaled egg in his hand began to release its sadness within the aura it released. "You can also tell, right?" Jason was unable to ask this out loud, but he could tell that the unhatched petrification serpent could sense that its mother would inevitably die during the next few minutes. It was unknown why exactly the strongest beasts of the mythic garden established an alliance against the petrification serpent, but Jason thought that a dozen eggs it laid had to be the biggest input. A single petrification serpent was already considered terrifying to each of the strongest beasts, but a dozen of them meant their imminent death. That was if they were to allow those eggs to hatch and grow to the same combat prowess its mother had. They were unable to accept this outcome and thus decided to enter the center of the mythic garden where they encountered the other beasts. Instead of attacking each other, they had formed a silent agreement that was starting to show its true color. Without a single sign, all beasts attacked the petrification serpent at the same time, overwhelming it within a few minutes. The weakening curse showed its effect, allowing the petrification serpent to seriously injure the silver-eyed rabbit and boneflame centipede, but that was already the most it could do against the onslaught of several of the strongest mythic garden beasts. When Jason perceived that the fight was more like a desperate means of the petrification serpent to inflict a few injuries in order to slither towards a certain location, he could hardly suppress cursing out. Instead, he said, "Sorry, in the universal language before he turned around in the opposite direction of the center. Exerting the weightless steps technique, he escaped from Mythic Garden's center, preventing any of those present low-lick stage beasts from perceiving that he had been there. Chapter 387 Will You Come With Me? By Hydesgrain. Almost a whole day had passed since Jason had run away from Mythic Garden's center, but he was not even remotely close to the rift or surrounding area of it. Owing to the fact that Artemis' wings were badly injured and recuperating slowly, he had to remain on the ground, where many obstacles and strong beasts forced him to take long detours. Adding that the unhatched petrification serpent was releasing its frustration, sadness, and agony with its aura throughout those 24 hours, many beasts had been attracted to him. This forced Jason to fight or run away before those stronger beasts were unable to find him anymore. In the end, he was not even sure what he should do with the petrification serpent egg which he embraced. It would be the biggest lie he ever told anyone, if he were to say that he didn't want to contract the petrification serpent as his soul bond. However, Jason was unsure if this was something it would even accept willingly. He could also force it, but that was not something Jason wanted to do, as he wanted to create a fortified soul conjunction with every beast he was to bind. After he had witnessed how powerful a fortified soul conjunction was, Jason couldn't help but think that he had to have one for every beast he bound to his soul world. Furthermore, he couldn't help but be curious how exactly curses would be affected by a fortified soul conjunction. However, in the end, this was not important to the petrification serpent egg. If it wanted to take revenge on the other beasts, Jason would most likely be unable to bind it as his soul bond. He was not even sure whether he would become too strong in the next 6 months, or if the Jewel Clan would change something in their assessment, preventing strangers from entering the Mythic Garden ever again. As such, he wouldn't be able to promise the unmatched petrification serpent to take revenge on its mother for its entire life. Binding a beast that would regret not being able to take revenge on its mother's murderer would be bad, to put it simply. At least if that was what the petrification serpent planned. There was also the possibility that beasts like the petrification serpent thought differently about revenge, because it was normal for beasts to prey on each other. With that in mind, Jason couldn't help but feel a small ray of hope emerging within him. It might be weird to feel like this, shortly after an unhatched beast lost its mother, but Jason's own situation was not great either. He had at most 1 week left before the Mythic Garden rift would close for 6 months, and Jason didn't want to stay inside the rift any longer. That was if he were to be honest with himself. If possible, he would bind a suitably cursed beast and rush back to the underground island. Jason was seriously pondering whether the Mythic Garden or the Jewel Clan was more dangerous to him, and in the end, he decided that he should try to find a way outside the underground island as quietly as possible. He remembered which teleportation circle the sovereign-ranked guardian had used, and his mana eyes perceived also the secret passcode that was intertwined into the magic circle. As such, he was confident in leaving the underground island secretly as long as the remaining mana inside the magic sphere was enough to empower the transportation circle. However, this was not something Jason should be bothered about right now. There was a large horde of cursed mid-unblemished beasts in front of him, staring at the petrification serpent egg inside his left hand. This caused him to frown, as he began to wonder if the egg in his hand was valuable to those longhorn jackals that attacked and cursed him with a weak destructive curse. This curse was a weaker version of the demonic three-eyed wolf's horrific destructive curse. However, instead of being able to injure someone badly, it created illusionary pain if the opponent was stronger than the longhorn jackals. After being targeted by around 100 of those weak, destructive curses, his entire being was overwhelmed by illusionary pain. Gritting his teeth, he unsheathed the light longsword with his free hand as he charged towards the longhorn jackals. His lips curled upwards as he manifested 2 large liquefied balls of poison which he threw towards the center of the longhorn jackal's horde. However, instead of maintaining the shape of a ball, Jason forced them to burst open in the most crowded area. The corrosive poison splattered everywhere, hitting several dozen longhorn jackals that cried out in pain, as Jason emerged in front of the first opponent. He had yet to dissolve Scorpio's exoskeleton and his stinger, which he did not do because he wanted to increase his pace with Scorpio's entire soul amplification. Using the stinger as a third means to attack next to his elemental attacks and the light longsword he pierced through the first Longhorn Jackal's head, everything went much smoother than he expected. The only issue was that he had to pay attention to the petrification serpent egg in his hand as he was shaken wildly. He twisted his body several times, evading the Longhorn Jackal's longhorns that were almost half a meter long. In the end, the jackals had the size of a horsefoal, were black in color with white yellowish longhorns on their forehead. It looked ridiculous, but Jason took them seriously even if their strength was only comparable to mid-unblemished beasts. He was much stronger, but he shouldn't take the large horde in front of him lightly, which might kill him if he were to do a wrong move. Then minutes later, Jason stood in a field of sizzling soil and corpses while the manifested stinger and his light longsword were drenched in crimson-colored blood. The petrification serpent egg was releasing emotions Jason couldn't decipher. However, instead of thinking too much about it, he continued to walk towards the direction he presumed the rift to be located. 3 hours later, his mana eyes were able to perceive the outlines of the big, complex rune that created the rift. Nevertheless, he didn't rush towards the rift, which he wanted to do in order to leave the mythic garden. Instead, he looked at the petrification serpent as he said, "I will leave this place soon, and it's unlikely that I can come back in the future. If you want, you can come with me as one of my companions. I won't force you, but your chances to survive inside the mythic garden without being nurtured and protected by your mother are small. Furthermore, you won't be able to become strong enough to take revenge on your mother's murderer because they might hunt you down once you're exposed." Jason said nothing but the harsh truth. It might be harmful to the petrification serpent if it was able to understand his words, but in the end, it was better to know the truth than living oblivious to it. Noticing that the petrification serpent didn't understand anything, Jason pondered what could have been different to the time it was able to comprehend his words, which caused him to speak in the universal language out of instinct. After that, the petrification serpent released several complex emotions within its aura, which Jason could hardly separate. They were so complex, intertwined with each other and overlapping, that he decided to not mind it for the time being. Instead, he walked towards the rift that was still quite a distance away from him. When he entered the planar around the rift, he was able to see many young human prodigies talking to each other, which caused him to cover his face because he didn't want to be seen by the wind affinity used from which he stole the egg. As such, he turned around to distance himself a little bit again when he remembered that the young man from the Warad family shouldn't have seen his face. However, in that case, there was still the egg in his hand, which was something he shouldn't openly show someone else in order to prevent greed from igniting within them. When he saw that the unhatched petrification serpent retraced its complex emotion, indicating to Jason that it calmed down, he couldn't help but ask hopefully, "What's your choice, little one? Will you come with me?" Chapter 388, Leaving the Mythic Garden by Hydesgrain. Jason understood that the unhatched petrification serpent had problems understanding him, but when he released his soul thread to show it, the language barrier between them didn't matter anymore. The petrification serpent within the black egg understood instinctively what Jason wanted to do, yet, it was unsure what exactly it wanted. Revenge. Freedom. Adventuring. In the end, the unhatched petrification serpent had yet to hatch, and it couldn't be considered an overly intelligent beast because it was still developing. The petrification serpent mother laid the eggs a few days prior, and the unhatched petrification serpent couldn't understand the meaning of most things. To put it simply, it didn't think about revenge right now, but it was only filled with sadness. Nevertheless, more than 3 hours passed before Jason received something similar to an answer. Shaking lightly, the egg in his hands released an aura whose meaning he couldn't understand. However, before he was even able to ask anything else, Jason's mana eyes perceived an astronomical amount of mana arising nearby the horizon. This mana stemmed from multiple beasts, and Jason was already familiar with them, which caused him to disregard everything as he said, I don't know if you accepted me, but I'll have to do this to survive. Don't release your aura when you want to remain inside the mythic garden, and target me with it if you want to come with me. But hurry up. Jason was unsure if his assumption was correct, but if what he received was correct, most terrifying ranked beasts that killed the petrification serpent mother were now hunting the small unhatched petrification serpent. The egg was in his hands, and if he didn't hurry up and escaped, he would be dead too. As such, he gave the petrification serpent one last chance. While he exerted the weightless steps technique to rush towards the rift whose surrounding area Jason left to prevent attracting too much of a commotion, he sensed that the unhatched petrification serpent targeted him with its aura. Taking this as permission, Jason released a thick thread from his soul which he smoothly moved through his body before he used Scorpio's exoskeleton to cut his free hand at a sharp edge. After that, he dissolved the exoskeleton subconsciously as he used his free hand to cover the greenish-black egg with which he started to form a soul bond. The pace at which the soul bond contract was formed was too slow, and Jason panicked for a short moment when he noticed how high the most terrifying ranked beast's pace was. Appearing inside the plane area where he saw many students talking to each other, he could only do two things. The first thing he did was to accelerate the pace at which the soul bond contract was formed by forcefully injecting more of his soul into the petrification serpent egg. This wouldn't cause any major injuries, but a slightly uncomfortable sensation until the contract was completed. 1 minute, that should be fine. Meanwhile, the second thing he could do to prevent a massacre nearby the rift to happen was to shout out loud. There are several of the most terrifying ranked beasts running towards the rift. Jason amplified his voice with mana, and there was nothing else that had to be said. Even if Jason lied, the other young prodigies who had heard him only doubted him for a few seconds before they perceived how fast he was running towards the rift. He looked like he was extremely stressed, running for his life, which gave the young prodigies Jason had already run past enough reason to pack up their stuff within a few seconds. Exerting their own movement technique, they followed Jason, while most of them were even able to overtake him, thanks to their high mana core rank. However, Jason didn't bother about that because he had to finish forming the soul bond contract before he would be able to pass through the rift. He felt uncomfortable with others seeing that he had the egg of a petrification serpent in his hand, and it would only be worse if someone outside the mythic garden were to see this. While he could fight against everyone inside the mythic garden if he were to be desperate enough, on Argos there were too many strong humans he couldn't fight yet. Jason might only be 15 years yet, but he was able to fight prodigies at the age of 20. That was under extreme condition, but Jason was confident that he could do it. As such, he would only need enough time to become strong enough to face even stronger opponents. Unfortunately, he couldn't disappear from the sight of the underground island just like that which he had hoped for, because he felt that the 6 months he and the other prodigies had spent within the mythic garden changed a lot on the archipelago and Canir. Only half a minute passed when Jason slowed down because there were only 100 meters between him and the rift that could save him from the most terrifying ranked beasts that were about to charge out of the small forest he had walked through a minute ago. "I'm sorry, little one," was the only thing he could say as he unleashed his soul world's full might, forcing its way through the soul thread Jason had loosened in order to form a bond with the unhatched petrification serpent that began to shake violently. Meanwhile, Jason was able to see the outlines of the demony three-eyed wolf behind those of a 2-meter-tall rabbit which he assumed to be the silver-eyed rabbit. Accelerating his pace again, he could hear the first prodigies screaming out in shock when they saw that Jason's words were true and that he didn't lie about the fact that some of the most terrifying ranked beasts were headed towards them. The demonic three-eyed wolf targeted a few prodigies with its curse, which was unable to kill anyone due to the enhanced weakening curse it was still targeted with, even after the petrification serpent mother had died. As such, Jason sighed in relief, thankful that he wouldn't die just by being targeted from the demonic three-eyed wolf's destructive curse. Increasing his pace again, Jason charged ahead and he appeared right in front of the rift when the unhatched petrification serpent egg entered his soul world. At this moment, he stepped through the rift while noticing that the petrification serpent's curse began to reach out to his soul world core, infesting it. Inside the rift, Jason's eyes were blindfolded once again, but instead of inserting mana into his mana eyes to dissipate those blindfolds, he focused on his soul world, which he entered mentally. There, he saw Artemis, Scorpio, and Solaris staring at the egg that was right next to the soul world core, releasing its curse towards the core. This caused the soul world core to retaliate, and the same scenario that happened with the prior curse he was targeted, occurred once again. His soul world shock, and the soul world core was trying to push away the curse that tried to establish a new shelter within the core. Before, Jason was just targeted by a curse, but this changed completely now that he had formed a soul bond contract with the said cursed beast. It would be extremely difficult up to impossible to revolt against the race-specific weakening curse which the petrification serpent harbored. Jason was unsure how much time passed, but he could tell that something about his soul world core changed substantially. Suddenly, Jason's eyes began to hurt, and the only thing he sensed from the soul world core was the fact that 10,000 soul energy units had been consumed by it to create something. Unfortunately, he was unable to see it because the pain spreading through his eyes was tormenting him. Chapter 389 Infiltration. War. By Hydesgrain. Jason didn't expect the curses, which the unhatched petrification serpent inherited to him, would take effect almost immediately. This was unpredicted, but at the same time good to occur right now instead of an even worse timing, like in front of the woman from the Jewel clan. If that were to happen, Jason would need to have a huge amount of luck or the best acting he could deliver to anyone doubting him. Initially, he had planned to investigate the things he could see within the rift itself, like the large green planet or the curse enveloping it, but that became insignificant. Right now, he had to endure the race-specific weakening curse transforming his soul world core while the petrification curse wreaked havoc within his mana eyes, trying to change something too. Jason knew that the petrification curse he inherits from the unhatched petrification serpent would be advantageous. Thus he could easily endure the pain, but Jason was unsure if his soul world core was strong enough to overcome the weakening curse. Something changed about the soul world core, and Jason only felt that it had absorbed 10,000 soul energy units to do something, yet, he was unable to figure out what exactly it was. This was not only annoying, but the pain in his eyes prevented him from doing anything further. An unknown amount of time passed before Jason had been expelled from the rift while the pain in his eyes had intensified. Meanwhile, his soul world core transmitted illusionary pain towards him which was spread through his entire body. When he left the rift, Jason had to rely on the mana fluctuations to scan everything in his surrounding. His strength was still unrestrained and comparable to someone who had barely advanced to the lowest lick stage. From his mana fluctuations, Jason perceived that there were many shocked and shivering young prodigies next to him, which allowed him to comprehend that they had escaped death closer than initially expected. However, Jason didn't think that it was as close as the others thought. The situation was not desperate enough to shiver and behave like pushovers. At least not if one was arrogant enough to call themselves prodigies. Walking around the young men and women that laid on the ground, gasping for air, happy to have survived, he could hear a familiar voice echoing through the whole underground island. "What the hell is our family doing? Mom. Explain to me what I've heard about the slave market and don't even try to fool me." It was Milan, and from his voice, one could tell that he was furious. On one side, Jason was happy to see this, but on the other hand, he found this act extremely foolish and naive. Yet, what astonished him was the other familiar voice he heard. "Calm down, Milan. Let's wait for Suo and then I'll bring you away. You don't even know what happened here during the last 6 months. I will explain everything later, alright? Just calm down." It was the voice of the woman, who he assumed to be the vice head or matriarch of the Jewel clan, the person that had called him out for having a fortified soul conjunction. "How can I calm down right now? Not only did nobody in our clan tell me what was going on, but I had to hear this from someone I just got to know. If he didn't ask something about the slave market by accident, I would have never heard anything about it. When would you have told me about it? When? Suddenly, right about the time he wanted to advance the discussion with his mother that everyone on the island could hear through the sheer volume he spoke out of anger, Milan sensed that his legs gave in. A moment later, he felt a hand around his shoulder holding him with force which would have been uncomfortable if he didn't felt the overly familiar mana fluctuations of Jason. Looking towards Jason, whose eyes were closed, thick drops of blood leaking from him, he could only exclaim, "Jason! What the hell happened with you?" Holding his ear with the free hand, Jason couldn't help but say in a quieter voice, "Hey Milan. I think you shouldn't be so loud right now." Smiling lightly he whispered, "At least not if you don't want to humiliate your mother in front of 100 descendants from all kinds of influential families and clans." Jason went all in right now. Instead of running away from the Jewel clan, acting as if he had something to hide, he had chosen the exact opposite path that should work out too. He might have something against the Jewel clan's attitude towards their weaker citizens and the fact that they enslaved humans, but that was something Jason had to set aside for now. When he heard that the woman who had called him out before was Milan's mother, Jason couldn't help but rejoice. If everything worked out, he would be able to come out of the underground island unscathed. Turning towards the woman with two solidified and a third, almost constructed prismarine crystal within her mana core, Jason bowed lightly before introducing himself. "Hello, my name is Jason and I was the person who accidentally revealed the slave market to Milan while I was with him and Iska inside the Mythic Garden. I'm sorry, but I guess it's better that he knows now, right?" Jason was unable to see the woman, who Milan quietly introduced as Yvonne Jewel, because his eyes were still aching as if they were burning in hell's fire. The only advantage that prevented him from screaming out in pain was his high resistance to pain and the fact that Solaris, the Tier 1 Black Origin flame, enveloped his eyeballs with its flames, soothing the pain. It was an uncomfortable feeling but seemed to help a little bit. From the outside, it looked weird too because the dried blood around his eyes highlighted the black flames that could be seen through Jason's eyelids. However, instead of showing interested in this, Yvonne Jewel sized up Jason as she said, "Weren't you the young man with the fortified soul conjunction? In 6 months you increase your mana core rank from the 4th expert rank to the 2nd master rank. Not bad, but not something someone with a superior talent should be proud about. At least not if you are the one who actively absorbed mana with Milan and Iska at one branch of the exposed mana vein." When Jason heard this, he thought that Milan had told his mother everything. As such, he couldn't help but turn around to Milan as he quietly mumbled to himself, "Are you a mama's boy?" Shaking his head, Jason was glad that Milan didn't say anything about his age, when he heard him retorting his mother. "What are you saying, Mom? His mana absorption rate is amazing, it's just that." Before Milan could even finish his sentence, he saw a fist he hadn't seen coming emerged right before his eyes as Jason lightly said with a faint smile on his face, "Do you want to pick a fight?" He was obviously joking, but Milan was shocked that he was unable to see the fist that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Meanwhile, Yvonne, who saw everything much slower, could tell that Jason's physical strength was already on par with her son, who had said that he advanced to the Magus rank. That meant Jason's mana core rank was not his entire strength. As such, she scanned his mana fluctuations, only to sense that they were also on par with her son's. Soul amplification. She just mumbled, which caused Jason to stiffen. The pain in his eyes increased, and Jason could also feel that the soul world core was about to merge with the curse it inherited after the soul bond contract with the petrification serpent egg had been completed. If his strength were to suddenly plummet in front of Yvonne Jewel and Milan at that, he would have lots of things to explain or quite a few problems at hand. As such, he straightened his back as he said, "I need to go back now. I need to report my arrival." This was neither entirely true nor false, but he had to say it like this to tell Yvonne that someone was waiting for him, most likely a big family or hidden, ancient clan. At least that was the most logical explanation for Jason's high strength. Yvonne, who thought exactly what Jason wanted her to think, pondered for a moment as she said, "Just tell me where you have to go. If you're a friend of Milan, I shouldn't allow you to leave alone, at least not right now." This confused both Jason and Milan. What is that about, right now? Did something happen? "Jason, if you're in a hurry you can leave, just go to Louis and tell him where you want to go, but it would be best for you to stay here for the next few days and leave with all of us at once. I don't want to scare you, but it looks like we are facing an infiltration of foreign races right now." "What?" Jason shouted out loud, which attracted the attention of the surrounding young men and women that tried to get the hang of themselves. He quieted down in an instant, and could only think about the Shadow Walkers as Yvonne sighed. "It's pretty obvious for all clans that foreign races collude every clan to have a stable supply of humans which they want to turn into some sort of superhumans or experiment with them. At least that is what we have been doing. But if I were to be honest, I'm not sure what they're doing with the people we are sending over. In the end, we are insignificant, and if we can become a little bit more important by colluding with the foreign races to stand up against them in the future, some people have to be sacrificed too. And those people are the weak, right? But does she truly understand how insignificant our race or even Argos is?" Jason didn't say anything, but he was able to understand how Yvonne thought according to her attitude and how she acted, which included the fact that she was not even a little bit suspicious about his identity. She was probably even aware that his identity for Terebrina's, Jason Lair, was faked, but that didn't seem to bother her. Instead, she explained and proved several things he and his masters only assumed to be correct. However, the thought that they could defeat those foreign races that supplied them with a minuscule part of their own resources was absurd, if one were to put it nicely. Unfortunately, some foreign races' tactics seemed to have changed, and several races, that mainly included the alliance around the Shadow Walkers. "We have already encountered more than 100 Shadow Walkers, and every single one of them is as strong as I am, if not stronger. The worst, however, is the fact that they don't seem to care about maintaining a good relationship with us anymore, because they started to abduct prodigies from big clans too. This has never happened, and mankind is about to establish a large alliance and wage war to protect our offsprings." When Jason heard this, he couldn't help but blurt out, "What bullshit, wage war against those who see our race as mere toys, great idea." Chapter 390, Misconception by Hydesgrain. Yvonne was astonished about how vulgar Jason's words suddenly became. Bullshit. She was about to lecture him that it was important to retaliate now that the foreign races started to infiltrate mankind's territory, when Jason's words echoed in her mind. Toys. That's something new. I've heard livestock or resource, but we've never been called toys. Jason felt Yvonne's stare on him, while her anger seemed to be substituted with questions. This caused him to ask bluntly, "I don't want to be too brisk, but Mrs. Jewel, you said that our race is insignificant, right? However, at the same time you're talking about fighting back with the resources we receive through the foreign races. Don't you think that they know what they're doing and expect this reaction? The resources they hand out in exchange for getting their hands on a constant supply of humans should be negligible or even worthless to them. Let me ask you 2 questions. What do you know about the insignificance of our race? And what would you say if I tell you that it's even worse than you might think?" Jason's reason to ask those questions was not to let Yvonne Jewel have a reality check or allow her to receive more information about other planets than Argos. Rather than that, he wanted to see how she would react and what she was going to do once he told her something she would never accept to believe. He had failed to accomplish the 3rd task which he had given himself during the last few months, getting to know what ingredients were needed to create the addictive cultivation drug. However, that was not necessarily bad. From the looks of it, Yvonne Jewel was not a completely bad person, and Jason could tell that she was different from Jael Drake. At least to some extent. She cared about her 2 sons and even offered Jason to bring him away once everyone left the underground island. This was something he didn't predict beforehand, and it made him a little bit curious about more things. He wouldn't accept her offer, but Jason could figure out quite a few things if he were to talk with Yvonne for some time. Unfortunately, before the Jewel clan matriarch could say something, someone rushed out of the crowd of young prodigies that were about to leave, charging straight into Jason and Milan. Jason, whose mana fluctuations were fully expanded, noticed this and took a step aside. Thus Iska, who was overjoyed to see Jason, crashed into Milan. Both laid on the ground, but Iska stood up hurriedly as he shouted, "Jason! You are alive! That's great! But how and what is wrong with your eyes? Where is the petrification serpent now? Did the other most terrifying ranked beasts pursue you because of the petrification serpent's egg scent that lingers on you?" At that moment, Jason had never been as frustrated to have become friends with someone like Milan and Iska as he was right now. How could their timing be so bad, every single time at that? This was not the first time, and Jason felt that it wouldn't be the last time either. While Jason was lamenting about Iska because he revealed too many things that not everyone on the underground island was supposed to hear, he was astonished that he didn't hear Milan asking him about what had happened. Iska had already started to tell the story from the moment he encountered Jason, who had manifested white wings on his back at that time. His storytelling ability was superb, and Jason, who was dragged out of his thoughts, couldn't help but listen intently until he remembered that he was exposing that he had survived the last incident with the petrification serpent egg in his hands. However, it was already too late, and if he were to intercept Iska, everything would become much more complicated than it had become. As such, he thought of a good story to explain how exactly he had survived. When Iska explained that everything was Feywirad's fault as he had stolen the petrification serpent's egg, Yvonne and Milan became angry. Milan was angry because his friends had almost died, while Yvonne Jewel's anger stemmed from the fact that their family's reputation could have suffered if there had been an incident inside the Mythic Garden. The death rate of 80% was a clear sign that the Mythic Garden was dangerous, but she encountered more than enough families spreading false rumors that her clan killed their prodigies within the Mythic Garden. If those prodigies that had been searching for the fate-changing fruit died at once, the Jewel clan would have suffered a lot. As such, she was glad that Jason, Iska, and Yoon had solved the problems from occurring. However, what astonished her were two facts. One fact was that Jason had obviously established two fortified conjunctions. This was something she understood when Iska continued with his story, as he explained how Jason protected himself with the sapphire-colored exoskeleton he summoned after the white wings had almost been cut. The second fact was also the most important point. Jason was still alive after the petrification serpent mother devoured him. It was likely that she only put him into her mouth to take care of her egg, but the fact that the petrification serpent mother didn't release her mana killed Jason shocked Yvonne a little bit. According to the information they gathered for more than a century, something like that had never happened. The same could be said for protecting a beast egg with one's body while the mother beast saw them being attacked by another human. As such, Yvonne couldn't tell if that was something similar to gratitude from the petrification serpent to have saved its offspring, or if Jason survived because he was special, which was pretty obvious. Not only was his name obviously faked, but, somehow, Yvonne Jewel thought that his whole hid prodigy assessment was planned and that not even his age was correct. His soul awakening should have been higher than a common 4-star rating too, which was not less shocking. However, Jason's strength was on par with her own son, while Jason's mana core rank was one whole rank below Milan's too. Clearing her throat, Yvonne was not sure what to say because something like the scenario she had heard about had never happened to her. Not only was Jason extremely mysterious and from an unknown background, but it looks like he knows more about the strength foreign races have and the human race's insignificance. Recalling Jason's words, "What if I tell you that it's even worse than you might think?" She couldn't help but contemplate asking him for more information. Suddenly, Jason noticed that the pain his soul world core caused him began to dissipate, which was extremely bad. Under normal circumstances he would be glad to feel less pain, but not if he couldn't tell what kind of reaction he would receive from others if they were to find out that he bound the petrification serpent egg to him. Averting his head to Yvonne Jewel, he suddenly said, "How can I leave the underground island? If it's possible, I would go back to Asgard again." Milan and Iska were astonished that Jason wanted to leave so quickly, and it was only when they saw a thick sweat pearl running down his temples, their astonishment turned into confusion. "Are your eyes hurting too much? How did you even hurt them? Will you go back to your family to heal them?" Milan suddenly asked, which caused Jason to extinguish the black flame around his eyes. The petrification curse within his eyes was unleashed and small drops of blood poured out of the corner of his eyes before Solaris ignited the flames again. This took less than a second, and Jason began to wonder if he would have already bleed out without Solaris's help. After seeing Jason's state, everyone's doubt was cleared. Even though Yvonne became curious about the healing flame Jason seemed to have contracted as his soul bond, she understood the situation. He has 2 fortified soul conjunctions from a winged beast and 1 with an exoskeleton, and now a flame that has a healing or maybe recuperating ability. He can't be 17 years old, otherwise, nothing would make sense. As such, instead of answering Jason's question immediately, she asked him about his age. The moment she asked this, she noticed that Jason avoided her, which was expected, and Milan was about to say something only to stop himself. This caused Yvonne to lift her eyes, confused that Milan, who told her every little detail about everything that occurred to him, which he had always done since he was a small child. "I'm younger than my ID says, that should be enough, right?" Smiling lightly, Jason openly said that his identity was faked, which reassured Yvonne in her thought that the youth in front of her belonged to an ancient clan. Some stricter ancient clans didn't like it if their prodigies revealed their information because of multiple reasons. Either they wanted to have their peace, protect others connected to them, or it had a different, deeper meaning. In the end, this was not important to Yvonne, and only one's combat prowess was important. Yvonne sighed after this and decided to let Jason off her hook. There was no need to pressure someone from the younger generation, and there was only one thing she wanted to know from him. "I can activate the transportation magic circle that brings you back to Asgard, but can you answer one last question?" Nodding his head, Jason couldn't help but feel that he knew what bothered Yvonne, and her question was similar to the one he expected. "What did you want to tell me when you said that mankind might be less insignificant than I think? Our planet is one among a few dozen and only awoke a few centuries ago, while other planets are a few centuries to 1 millennium older. Is there more?" When Jason heard this, he couldn't help but laugh out loud, which confused everyone around them. "That's probably what your trusted allies from the foreign races told you, right? Never heard something so ridiculous. I think you wouldn't even come close to the truth if you add a few zeros to everything you said."